Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being begun in October 2025, and probably it's also going to be completed in October 2025, but we will be posting it in parts. It's an audiobook and discussion of Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, written in 1916 and first published in 1917. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So imperialism is a long time coming. A lot of people have requested this. However, when I started this channel, really the backbone of the entire channel is the basic Marxism-Leninism reading list. I wanted to read Marxism-Leninism. I wanted to study it. I wanted to go beyond memes. I wanted to go beyond anarchism. I wanted to be a communist. So I found that reading list online, and I said, I'm going to read this in order. Now, there have been a lot of side readings as we've gone, but as for the readings in the basic list, I wanted to stick to the order that they were presented in because they were presented that way for a reason. And in the recording and sharing of these readings, well, that's what I've stuck to. Now, the first reading was about 5.5 years ago, February 2020. A lot of things have happened since then, and I'm happy to report that a lot of my questions that I had coming into starting this channel, I have a much better understanding of. If they haven't been answered completely, at least, again, my understanding is a lot more advanced than it was back then. And some of those questions were things like what happened to the communist movement, what happened to the Soviet Union, what's going on with China, why haven't the USA and Europe had revolutions, and just all the interrelated questions going along with that. What's it going to take to build up a fighting movement again? What are the key challenges that we face, etc.? And I'm really proud of the work that we've done, both me doing the actual content of the channel and the community contributing to and supporting that. And this topic, imperialism, and the concept of imperialism as a stage of capitalism is such an important one for understanding the world today and for formulating correct workers' politics. It's really central, and if you don't understand this, you're going to have trouble with everything else. Marxism-Leninism itself is Marxism updated for the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution, so it's important to understand what sets this stage of capitalism apart from its earlier existence. And World War I, which was going on at the time that Lenin was writing this, is a prime example. The question of how socialist parties should orient themselves to World War I was a make or break test for the Second Socialist International, and a lot of it came down on the opportunist position, as discussed previously in this playlist, of supporting the war. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, had the position of revolutionary defeatism, as advanced in pieces like The Defeat of One's Own Government in the Imperialist War by Lenin from 1915, and if you haven't listened to that, I urge you to do so. Basically, Lenin's argument was that as imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, capitalism can offer no more progress to human society, human history, and the only way to achieve a progressive outcome from the war was not for workers to kill each other for the sake of the imperialist profits and market share, but to turn the war for the imperialists into a revolutionary civil war against the imperialists. A war like that is a major time of vulnerability for imperialism. They have, since World War II, managed to avoid that kind of situation where they're putting themselves in a vulnerable position by settling inter-imperialist conflicts differently, more diplomatically, but there is a limit to how long that can go on for, and if there was enough economic chaos and there was enough strife between the various imperialist blocs, then it's possible that they would be left without recourse but to have another world war. And if that were to happen, the workers' movements of the world would have to come up with a progressive response, which means divesting from fighting for imperialism. But as we're going to hear in this book, imperialism is not just when a major power is a bully or is mean or does things that we don't like. It is a stage of capitalism which has particular characteristics. And again, the implication of its being the highest stage of capitalism is the only thing after this is socialism. The only thing you can fight for after this that is progressive is socialism. And the capitalists, for their part, will be fighting with every weapon they have to try to hang on to the dying capitalist system. Let's go ahead and read the credits here. This was written in January to June 1916, first published in mid-1917 in pamphlet form in Petrograd, published according to the manuscript and verified with the text of the pamphlet. The The source is Lenin's Selected Works, Progress Publishers, 1963, Moscow, Volume 1, HTML transcription and markup by Tim Delaney and Kevin Goins in 2008, and it's in the public domain in the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive. Marxists.org, thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Let's begin. Preface. The pamphlet here presented to the reader was written in the spring of 1916 in Zurich. In the conditions in which I was obliged to work there, I naturally suffered somewhat from a shortage of French and English literature and from a serious dearth of Russian literature. However, I made use of the principal English work on imperialism, the book by J.A. Hobson, with all the care that, in my opinion, that work deserves. This pamphlet was written with an eye to the Tsarist censorship. Hence, I was not only forced to confine myself strictly to an exclusively theoretical, specifically economic analysis of facts, but to formulate the few necessary observations on politics with extreme caution, by hints, in an allegorical language, in that accursed Aesopian language, to which Tsarism compelled all revolutionaries to have recourse whenever they took up the pen to write a, quote, legal work. It is painful in these days of liberty to reread the passages of the pamphlet, which have been distorted, cramped, compressed in an iron vice on account of the censor, that the period of imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution, that social chauvinism, which is socialism in words, chauvinism in deeds, is the utter betrayal of socialism, complete desertion to the side of the bourgeoisie, that the split in the working class movement is bound up with the objective conditions of imperialism, etc. On these matters I had to speak in a slavish tongue, and I must refer the reader who is interested in the subject to the articles I wrote abroad in 1914-17, a new edition of which is soon to appear. In order to show the reader, in a guise acceptable to the censors, how shamelessly untruthful the capitalists and the social chauvinists who have deserted to their side, and whom Kautsky opposes so inconsistently, are on the question of annexations, in order to show how shamelessly they screen the annexations of their capitalists, I was forced to quote as an example, Japan. The careful reader will easily substitute Russia for Japan, and Finland, Poland, Courland or Latvia, the Ukraine, Khiva, Bukhara, Estonia, or other regions peopled by non-Great Russians for Korea. I trust that this pamphlet will help the reader to understand the fundamental economic question, that of the economic essence of imperialism, for unless this is studied, it will be impossible to understand and appraise modern war and modern politics. Lenin, Petrograd, April 26, 1917. And now the preface to the French and German editions. Section 1. As was indicated in the preface to the Russian edition, this pamphlet was written in 1916, with an eye to the Tsarist censorship. I am unable to revise the whole text at the present time, nor perhaps would this be advisable, since the main purpose of the book was, and remains to present, on the basis of the summarized returns of irrefutable bourgeois statistics and the admissions of bourgeois scholars of all countries, a composite picture of the world capitalist system in its international relationships at the beginning of the 20th century, on the eve of the First World Imperialist War. To a certain extent, it will even be useful for many communists in advanced capitalist countries to convince themselves by the example of this pamphlet, legal from the standpoint of the Tsarist censor, of the possibility and necessity of making use of even the slight remnants of legality which still remain at the disposal of the communists, say, in contemporary America or France after the recent almost wholesale arrests of communists, the first Red Scare, in order to explain the utter falsity of social pacifist views and hopes for, quote, world democracy, comment under capitalism. Continuing, the most essential of what should be added to the censored pamphlet I shall try to present in this preface. Section 2. It is proved in the pamphlet that the war of 1914-18 was imperialist, that is, an annexationist, predatory war of plunder on the part of both sides. It was a war for the division of the world, for the partition and repartition of colonies and spheres of influence of finance capital, etc. Proof of what was the true social, or rather the true class character of the war, is naturally to be found not in the diplomatic history of the war, but in an analysis of the objective position of the ruling classes in all the belligerent countries. In order to depict this objective position, one must not take examples or isolated data. In view of the extreme complexity of the phenomena of social life, it is always possible to select any number of examples or separate data to prove any proposition. Comment, don't cherry pick. Continuing, but all the data on the basis of economic life in all the belligerent countries and the whole world. It is precisely irrefutable summarized data of this kind that I quoted in describing the partition of the world in 1876 and 1914 in Chapter 6, and the division of the world's railways in 1890 and 1913 in Chapter 7. Railways are a summation of the basic capitalist industries, coal, iron, and steel. A summation and the most striking index of the development of world trade and bourgeois democratic civilization. How the railways are linked up with large-scale industry, with monopolies, syndicates, cartels, trusts, banks, and the financial oligarchy is shown in the preceding chapters of the book. The uneven distribution of the railways, their uneven development, sums up, as it were, modern monopolist capitalism on a worldwide scale. And this summary proves that imperialist wars are absolutely inevitable under such an economic system, as long as private property in the means of production exists. Let's read that again. And this summary proves that imperialist wars are absolutely inevitable under such an economic system, as long as private property in the means of production exists. Continuing, the building of railways seems to be a simple, natural, democratic, cultural, and civilizing enterprise. That is what it is in the opinion of the bourgeois professors who are paid to depict capitalist slavery in bright colors, and in the opinion of petty bourgeois Philistines. Comment: a Philistine is somebody who is anti-intellectual, concerned solely with the pursuit of money, and hostile to cultural refinement. Continuing, but as a matter of fact, the capitalist threads, which in thousands of different intercrossings bind these enterprises with private property and the means of production in general, have converted this railway construction into an instrument for oppressing 1,000 million people, that's a billion, in the colonies and semi-colonies. That is, more than half the population of the globe that inhabits the dependent countries, as well as the wage slaves of capital in the quote-unquote civilized countries. Private property based on the labor of the small proprietor, free competition, democracy, all the catchwords with which the capitalists and their press deceive the workers and the peasants are things of the distant past. Comment: Lenin's not saying here that the deception is a thing of the distant past, but that old kind of capitalism, which was actually characterized more by the things that he was just listing, those are the things of the past as they've given way increasingly to monopolization, consolidation, centralization, which is the natural logic of capitalism if you let it play out. The deception is that that's still the way that it is, but the whole point of this book is that capitalism has reached a new and final stage called imperialism. Continuing, capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of quote-unquote advanced countries. And this booty is shared between 2 or 3 powerful world plunderers armed to the teeth. For example, America, Great Britain, Japan, who are drawing the whole world into their war over the division of their booty. Section 3. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, dictated by monarchist Germany. Comment: this treaty was a major sore point for revolutionary Russia as it was withdrawing from World War I, and accepting it was a move that Lenin defended repeatedly against what he described as ultra-left criticisms in many articles of the time, including in a collection that we have on the channel as a playlist titled Lenin on Petty Bourgeois Revolutionism. Continuing, and the subsequent, much more brutal and despicable Treaty of Versailles, dictated by the quote-unquote democratic republics of America and France, and also by quote-unquote Free Britain, have rendered a most useful service to humanity by exposing both imperialism's hired coolies of the pen and petty bourgeois reactionaries who, although they call themselves pacifists and socialists, sang praises to Wilsonism and insisted that peace and reforms were possible under imperialism. The tens of millions of dead and maimed left by the war, a war to decide whether the British or German group of financial plunderers is to receive the most booty, and those 2 quote-unquote peace treaties are with unprecedented rapidity opening the eyes of the millions and tens of millions of people who are downtrodden, oppressed, deceived, and duped by the bourgeoisie. Thus, out of the universal ruin caused by the war, a worldwide revolutionary crisis is arising which, however prolonged and arduous its stages may be, cannot end otherwise than in a proletarian revolution and in its victory. The Basel Manifesto of the Second International, which in 1912 gave an appraisal of the very war that broke out in 1914, and not of war in general, for there are different kinds of wars, including revolutionary wars, this manifesto is now a monument exposing to the full the shameful bankruptcy and treachery of the heroes of the Second International. Comment: we have the Basel Manifesto of the Second International on the channel. Continuing, that is why I reproduce this manifesto, although the editor adds this manifesto is not given as an appendix to this edition. but again, we do have it on the channel as an audiobook, as a supplement to the present edition, and again I urge the reader to note that the heroes of the Second International are as assiduously avoiding the passages of this manifesto which speak precisely, clearly, and definitely of the connection between that impending war and the proletarian revolution as a thief avoids the scene of his crime. Section 4. Special attention has been devoted in this pamphlet to a criticism of Kautskyism, the international ideological trend represented in all countries of the world by the, quote, most prominent theoreticians, the leaders of the Second International, Otto Bauer and Company in Austria, Ramsay MacDonald and others in Britain, Albert Thomas in France, etc., and a multitude of socialists, reformists, pacifists, bourgeois Democrats, and parsons. This ideological trend is on the one hand a product of the disintegration and decay of the Second International, and on the other hand the inevitable fruit of the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie, whose entire way of life holds them captive to bourgeois and democratic prejudices. The views held by Kautsky and his like are a complete renunciation of those same revolutionary principles of Marxism that writer has championed for decades, especially, by the way, in his struggle against socialist opportunism of Bernstein, Millerand, Heinemann, Gompers, etc. It is not a mere accident, therefore, that Kautsky's followers all over the world have now united in practical politics with the extreme opportunists through the Second or Yellow International, and with the bourgeois governments, comment soon to be fascist governments, see Fascism and Social Revolution by Dutt 1935, which we have here on the channel for more, continuing, through bourgeois coalition governments in which socialists take part. The growing world proletarian revolutionary movement in general, and the communist movement in particular, cannot dispense with an analysis and exposure of the theoretical errors of Kautskyism. The more so since pacifism and quote-unquote democracy, bourgeois and petty bourgeois democracy in general, which lay no claim to Marxism whatever, but which, like Kautsky and Company, are obscuring the profundity of the contradictions of imperialism and the inevitable revolutionary crisis to which it gives rise, are still very widespread all over the world. To combat these tendencies is the bounden duty of the party of the proletariat, which must win away from the bourgeoisie the small proprietors who are duped by them, and the millions of working people who enjoy more or less petty bourgeois conditions of life. Section 5. A few words must be said about Chapter 8, Parasitism and Decay of Capitalism. As already pointed out in the text, Hilferding, ex-quote-unquote Marxist, and now a comrade in arms of Kautsky and one of the chief exponents of bourgeois, reformist policy in the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, has taken a step backward on this question, compared with the frankly pacifist and reformist Englishman Hobson. The international split of the entire working class movement is now quite evident, the Second International and the Third Communist International, or Comintern. The fact that armed struggle and civil war is now raging between the two trends is also evident. The support given to Kolchak and Denikin in Russia by the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries against the Bolsheviks. The fight the Scheidemans and Naskas have conducted in conjunction with the bourgeoisie against the Spartacists, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in Germany. The same thing in Finland, Poland, Hungary, etc. What is the economic basis of this world historical phenomenon? It is precisely the parasitism and decay of capitalism, characteristic of its highest historical stage of development, i.e. imperialism. As this pamphlet shows, capitalism has now singled out a handful, less than 1/10 of the inhabitants of the globe, less than 1/5 at a most generous and liberal calculation, of exceptionally rich and powerful states, which plunder the whole world simply by clipping coupons, so to speak. Capital exports yield an income of 8 to 10,000 million francs per annum, at pre-war prices and according to pre-war bourgeois statistics. Now, of course, they yield much more. Obviously, out of such enormous super profits, we call them that since they're obtained over and above the profits which capitalists squeeze out of the workers of their quote-unquote own country, it is possible to bribe the labor leaders and the upper stratum of the labor aristocracy. And that is just what the capitalists of the quote-unquote advanced countries are doing. They are bribing them in 1,000 different ways, direct and indirect, overt and covert. This stratum of workers turned bourgeois, or the labor aristocracy, who are quite Philistine in their mode of life, in the size of their earnings, and in their entire outlook, is the principal prop of the Second International, and in our days the principal social, not military, prop of the bourgeoisie. For they are the real agents of the bourgeoisie in the working class movement, the labor lieutenants of the capitalist class, real vehicles of reformism and chauvinism. In the civil war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, they inevitably, and in no small numbers, take the side of the bourgeoisie, the Versaillais against the communards, to reference the Paris Commune. Unless the economic roots of this phenomenon are understood and its political and social significance is appreciated, not a step can be taken toward the solution of the practical problem of the communist movement and of the impending social revolution. Let's read that again. Unless the economic roots of this phenomenon are understood and its practical and social significance is appreciated, not a step can be taken toward the solution of the practical problem of the communist movement and of the impending social revolution. Imperialism is the eve of the social revolution of the proletariat. This has been confirmed since 1917 on a worldwide scale. And Lenin, July 6, 1920. And then there's one final concluding section. During the last 15 to 20 years, especially since the Spanish-American War, 1898, and the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, the economic and also the political literature of the two hemispheres has more and more often adopted the term imperialism in order to describe the present era. In 1902, a book by the English economist J.A. Hobson, Imperialism, was published in London and New York. This author, whose point of view is that of bourgeois social reformism and pacifism, which in essence is identical with the present point of view of the ex-Marxist Karl Kautsky, gives a very good and comprehensive description of the principal specific economic and political features of imperialism. In 1910, there appeared in Vienna the work of the Austrian Marxist Rudolf Hilferding, Finance Capital, Russian edition, Moscow 1912. In spite of the mistake the author makes on the theory of money, and in spite of a certain inclination on his part to reconcile Marxism with opportunism, this work gives a very valuable theoretical analysis of the, quote, latest phase of capitalist development, unquote, as the subtitle runs. Indeed, what has been said of imperialism during the last few years, especially in an enormous number of magazine and newspaper articles, and also in the resolutions, for example, of the Chemnitz and Basel Congresses, which took place in the autumn of 1912, has scarcely gone beyond the ideas expounded, or more exactly, summed up by the two writers mentioned above. Later on, I shall try to show briefly and as simply as possible the connection and relationships between the principal economic features of imperialism. I shall not be able to deal with the non-economic aspects of the question, however much they deserve to be dealt with. References to literature and other notes which perhaps would not interest all readers are to be found at the end of this pamphlet.